My name is Franklin Cole, and at 72 years old, folks around here had already written me off. They said my back was bent, my farm was barren, and my ways were relics of another century. To them, I was just an old man clinging to a patch of dirt that no one wanted. But to me, this land was blood, sweat, and memory. Every fence post carried the echo of my father's hammer. Every field had been tilled by hands tougher than mine. To call it worthless wasn't just an insult to me. It was an insult to every Cole who had come before. The farm sat on the edge of Maplewood County, 300 acres of rolling hills, crooked fence lines, and barns that leaned like tired men. The paint on the farmhouse had peeled long ago, and the roof sagged in the middle. But when the morning sun cut across the fields, I still saw beauty. I rose with the dawn, brewed black coffee on the stove, and pulled on the same boots I'd worn for decades. My knees ached, my shoulders creaked, but I walked the property each morning as if it were holy ground. But the town no longer saw it that way. The new generation, men in press suits with soft hands, laughed at the sight of me fixing fences with weathered boards. At the diner, I heard them whisper, "Old Frank still thinks his farm means something." Even my own nephew Jason, who once rode on my tractor as a boy, now mocked me openly. "Uncle Frank," he'd say at family gatherings, smirking in front of others, "maybe it's time you admitted that land isn't worth the dirt under your boots. Sell it, buy yourself a condo in town, and let progress move forward." Each time, I forced a smile, but the words cut deep. I wasn't deaf to the laughter, nor blind to the pitying glances. To them, my insistence on holding on to the farm wasn't resilience, it was foolishness. Still, I held on. Not because I was stubborn, but because I knew the land wasn't done speaking. One autumn evening, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low. The air smelled of cut hay and wood smoke. In the distance, I could see the faint glow of Maplewood's new subdivisions, rows of cookie-cutter houses sprouting where farmland had once stretched. Jason and his friends had already sold off much of their inheritance for quick money, but my land remained. To developers, it was wasted potential. To me, it was the last piece of our family's backbone. I remembered my father's voice from long ago, steady and sure. "This land has more in it than you'll ever know, Frank. Treat it right, and it'll carry you when everything else fails." At the time, I thought he only meant crops and cattle. But now, sitting alone on that porch, I wondered if he had seen deeper than I ever had. The world thought I was finished. Jason laughed at my old ways. The town muttered about selling out, and neighbors shook their heads when they saw me still plowing fields with aging machines. But what none of them understood, what none of them could understand, was that this land still had secrets, and I was the only one patient enough to wait for them to surface. They mocked me, called me foolish, told me my farm was worthless. One day soon, they'd learn just how wrong they were. If you want to see how quickly a town decides your worth, refuse to sell what everyone else has already priced. Within a month of Jason's latest speech about progress, the knocks started, soft at first, then insistent, each one arriving with a smile that didn't reach the eyes and a folder that clicked open like a trap. The first visitor came in a truck too clean for gravel roads. The decals on the door said Green Ridge Development, all pine trees and fresh paint. The man who climbed out wore loafers that hated dust, and a jacket with a stitched logo where a name ought to be. He looked past me while he introduced himself, the way a buyer stares into a window at something he already believes he owns. "Mr. Cole," he began, stepping onto the porch without being invited, "you're sitting on 300 acres of opportunity. Our firm can make this easy. Lump sum, quick close, no headaches. I've worked up numbers you'll find generous." He slid the folder toward me. I didn't take it. Generous by whose measure? "Market realities," he said smoothly. "You know, the land's tired. Water table's not what it used to be. Access roads need work. Frankly, you'd be smart to cash out while there's still a buyer. These old places lose value fast. I finally looked at the paper. Their offer wouldn't have bought my father's barn boards, much less the ground they'd weathered. "No," I said, handing the folder back. "The farm isn't for sale." He laughed softly, like I'd told a quaint joke. "Everything's for sale, Mr. Cole. Even memory." "Not here," I said, and shut the door gently enough to make the point. 2 days later, the bank called. Not my old branch. The new one with glass walls and a lobby that smelled like citrus. The manager, a young man named Carter Pike, had the kind of voice that practiced compassion as a language. He said words like prudence and portfolio risk, and asked if I'd considered monetizing the acreage to shore up my retirement planning. "I'm planning to keep what I've got," I told him. He cleared his throat. "Property taxes increase next cycle. Maintenance costs on older structures climb. If you need a bridge loan, we'd have to see collateral." He left the rest unsaid. Sell or borrow, and borrowing meant handing him the keys if a season went bad. After the bank came appraisals, men who parked at the end of the lane and measured with eyes rather than tools. They saw peeling paint and slumping fences and wrote down depreciation. They did not see the field that warmed fastest in spring, or the way the north pasture stayed dry even after the river swelled, or the hedgerow that blunted the worst of January's wind. Their numbers, when they arrived, carried a tidy cruelty, a tidy farm, tidy price, tidy end. At the diner, the whispers shifted from pity to certainty. "Frank'll sell," someone said over a cup that never left the saucer. "He has to. Taxes alone will choke him." Jason sat 2 stools down that morning, shining in a city coat, tapping his phone like a man orchestrating a parade. He didn't look at me when he said, just loud enough, "Some folks confuse history with value. Land that doesn't produce is just ground." I finished my eggs and left change under the salt shaker the way I always had. Outside, the wind gnawed at the flag over the post office and carried the smell of damp earth across Main Street. The soil had its own clock. It never hurried. Pressure finds new doors when you don't open the first ones. The county assessor sent a letter re-evaluating improvements I had never claimed. The insurance adjuster suggested upgrades that would triple my premium if I declined them. A code officer, new to the job and proud of his clipboard, noticed my barn roof sag and hinted a red tag might protect the public. Each knock wore a polite badge. Each badge had a boss who liked developers. Then Jason came himself, flanked by a real estate agent who spoke in square footage and future phases. They didn't bother to ask inside. We stood on the porch, the 3 of us, with the afternoon sun bleaching the fields to a soft gold and the cicadas sawing away like old fiddlers. "Uncle Frank," Jason said, the words dressed like respect, "we've all been worried. Managing this much land at your age, it's not fair to you. I can take this burden off your hands. We have a buyer who'll honor the family name, and I'll make sure you're comfortable." "Comfortable how?" I asked. "The numbers are strong," the agent chimed in, opening a folder. "Very strong considering deferred maintenance. And there's a timeline. We'd need signatures this month to lock it." I looked at Jason, not the paper. "You came here to help me, then?" "Out of kindness," his smile faltered. "Out of common sense." I let the quiet stretch until the agent shifted her weight. "No," I said. "This land isn't a burden. It's a promise. I keep my promises." He exhaled, impatient. "You're clinging to a past that's already gone." "Maybe," I said. "Or maybe you're trying to sell a future that isn't yours." He left angry, boots chewing the gravel, the real estate agent trailing with her folder pressed tight. At the lane's end, he turned, eyes narrowed. "Don't be surprised when the county and bank stop playing nice. People have limits." "They do," I said. "That's why we build fences." After they left, I walked the line from the south gate to the creek. The fences did need work. So did the roof. So did the tractor's left rear tire, which lost a little air each week like a stubborn secret. I catalogued the failings the way you do when you love something, precisely without despair. Love is not blindness, it is seeing the worst and staying anyway. My sister Ruth, widowed and fierce in that gentle way only older sisters can be, brought stew that evening and watched me eat as if soup could fortify a man against banks. "They're circling, Frank," she said, drying her hands on a towel she'd brought from home. "You'll have to give them an answer louder than no." "I already did." She tilted her head. "Then give it again, but in a language they understand." "What language is that?" "Paper," she said. "Theirs is cheap. Yours needs to be real." After she left, I pulled down the old deed box, oak with a brass latch, heavier than I remembered, and set it on the kitchen table. Inside were brittle copies of land grants, mineral rights, affidavits my father had insisted we keep even when neighbors swore such things were for Texans, and tax receipts smoother from being touched than from time. I read until the lamp sputtered, dates, boundaries, clauses that looked like fences made of words. The next morning I drove to the county records office. The clerk, a thin woman with a tidy bun, peered at me over glasses. "Mr. Cole, what can we do for you?" "Copies," I said. "Certified. Everything tied to Cole land, back to when your books begin." She raised her brows. "That's a stack. I've carried heavier." Back home, I spread those copies beside the appraisals and the offers, a blizzard of papers that tried to tell different stories. One said worthless. One said inevitable. Mine said belonging. While the kettle rumbled, I ran a finger under a phrase my father had underlined in fading ink. "All rights in and to the subsurface estate are hereby reserved to the grantor and his heirs." I didn't pretend to be a lawyer, but I knew a promise when I read one. The ground beneath your feet can hold more than crops and graves. Sometimes it holds the one answer that shuts 1,000 mouths. But that answer wasn't for today. Today was for mending hinge pins with wire, for greasing the baler that still worked if you spoke to it kindly, for waving to the school bus as it heaved past and scattered laughter down the lane. Today was for refusing to be hurried by men who measured life in quarters instead of seasons. At dusk, I watched headlights crawl along the ridge road, Jason's truck again, or one like it. It paused where my property line met his memory, then moved on. The sky went violet. Bats scribbled the first cursive of night above the barn. I breathed the sweet rot smell of hay and the cool hint of water living under rock. They kept saying worthless, like repeating it might make it true. The thing about land and men who belong to it is that value doesn't argue. It waits. It sinks its roots and waits for weather to change, for eyes to sharpen, for truth to rise the way a spring does when the frost lets go. I stacked the certified copies back into the box, latched it, and slid it beneath the bench where my boots sleep. Let the banks talk about portfolios. Let developers count roofs they hadn't raised yet. Let my nephew practice pity in a mirror until it passed for love. This farm wasn't finished, and neither was I. The whispers about my worthless farm didn't stop when I shut the door on developers. If anything, they grew louder. What began as quiet talk at the diner soon sharpened into laughter in town, and by Thanksgiving, those same words had crept into my own bloodline. Jason had always been ambitious. As a boy, he shadowed me around the farm, asking 1,000 questions about plows and soil, about weather and crops. I once thought he might be the one to carry it all forward, but somewhere along the way, ambition soured. He stopped asking how things grew and started asking how much they would sell for. That November, Ruth convinced me to attend the family dinner. "You can't stay holed up forever, Frank," she said. "Even wolves show their faces to the pack." I went, though my gut told me not to. Jason had rented the banquet hall at the country club, all chandeliers and crystal glasses, a far cry from the long wooden tables where our family used to share potluck dishes and laughter. His friends in pressed suits were there, along with cousins who hadn't stepped foot on a farm in years. When I walked in wearing my old wool coat, conversation dipped for half a heartbeat before resuming with forced brightness. Jason spotted me and clapped me on the back like a politician greeting a constituent. "Uncle Frank, glad you made it. Have a seat. We've got plenty of room." The seat he gestured to was at the far end of the table, next to the caterer's station, as if I were part of the hired help. Ruth bristled, but I held my tongue and sat down. Dinner began with speeches. Jason stood, wine glass in hand, and raised his voice. "Tonight, we celebrate family, tradition, and the future. Maplewood is growing, and we Coles must grow with it. We've got developments lined up, investors eager, and new projects that will put our name on the map." Applause rippled. I stayed still. Then he smiled that polished smile and turned his glass slightly in my direction. "Of course, some folks still think the old ways are best. But let's be honest. Plows and barns won't build tomorrow. Sometimes holding on too long only holds everyone else back." Laughter spread across the table, sharp and knowing. A few tried to soften it with nervous chuckles, but the sting was plain. Ruth slammed her fork down. "Jason Cole, you ought to be ashamed." He raised his hands innocently. "I'm just speaking truth, Aunt Ruth. Progress waits for no one." I looked at him then, really looked. The boy who once beamed when I let him drive the tractor, now smirked at me like a man who thought he had outgrown his teacher. I could have stood, could have told them all about the papers in my deed box, the mineral rights everyone had forgotten, the soil that might yet yield more than corn. But I didn't, not yet. Instead, I pushed back my chair and said, "If progress means mocking your elders, then maybe progress is the wrong name for it." The room fell quiet, the clink of silverware loud in the silence. I tipped my hat to Ruth, nodded at the others, and walked out without another word. Behind me, I heard Jason mutter, just loud enough, "The old man's pride will bury him." He was wrong. It wasn't my pride that would bury anyone. It was theirs. After that Thanksgiving dinner, the whispers turned into knocks, and the knocks into threats dressed in polite envelopes. The farm was no longer just the talk of Maplewood. It had become a target. Developers circled like buzzards over roadkill. They came in trucks with tinted windows, wearing shoes that had never seen mud. Each one carried the same bright folder with maps and charts, promising vision and progress. They all spoke the same lines, too polished to be coincidence. "Mr. Cole, this land is too much for one man. Sell now, while you still can. The future doesn't wait." When I turned them down, their smiles cracked. Some leaned in close and lowered their voices. "You can't hold on forever. The taxes will drown you. The county won't keep carrying your burden." And, as if on cue, the county did come knocking. One morning I found a notice stapled to my gatepost, a code violation. The old barn, sagging on its eastern wall, was now declared a hazard. "Immediate repairs or fines," it read in bold type. Another week, another letter. My property had been reassessed for higher taxes. When I called the office, the clerk said blandly, "It's just procedure, Mr. Cole. Nothing personal." But I knew better. At the bank, the pressure doubled. That young manager, Carter Pike, called me in with the look of a man reading from a script. "Mr. Cole, your operating account has slipped. With rising taxes and maintenance costs, perhaps it's time to liquidate some assets." I leaned forward. "You mean sell the land?" He smiled thinly. "You'd walk away comfortable. Isn't that what you want at your age?" At my age. Always those words, sharpened to cut. I told him what I'd told the developers. "This land isn't for sale." He tapped his pen against the desk. "Then I'd suggest you prepare for consequences. The county won't wait. Neither will we." By spring, Jason joined the chorus openly. He showed up one evening, parking his gleaming truck where my father's wagon used to stand. He wore the kind of cologne you could smell before the door slammed. "Uncle Frank," he said, leaning against the porch rail like he owned it, "you're making this harder than it has to be. Everyone knows the farm's worthless. Sell it, take the money, and live out your days without stress." "And if I don't?" I asked. He smirked. "Then don't be surprised when the county bleeds you dry. Or when the bank takes the land anyway. You think they'll show mercy because your name is Cole? I didn't answer, not with words. I just stared at him until his grin faltered, then turned and walked back inside. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with my father's deed box open again. The papers whispered their promise. Mineral rights, water rights, all recorded and sealed decades ago. Jason didn't know. The developers didn't know. Not yet. But soon they would. They thought they were tightening a noose around an old man's neck. What they didn't realize was that I'd been quietly holding the rope in my own hands all along. Winter passed heavy that year, the kind of cold that cracks wood and stiffens joints. Each morning I rose before dawn, lit the stove, and stared out the frosted window across the fields. Snow softened the hills, but beneath that quiet blanket I could still see every fence line, every ditch, every acre that my father's hands had worked before mine. Yet I felt the weight of being alone more than ever. Ruth stopped by often, her casseroles steaming in glass dishes, her eyes full of worry. "Frank," she said one night as we ate in silence, "you can't carry this fight forever. They'll grind you down. Jason's not going to quit. Neither will the county or the bank." I set my fork down. "This farm isn't theirs to take, Ruth." It never was. She studied me with that sister's gaze that cuts deeper than words. But it's not just land anymore. It's become a symbol. They want you to fall, because if you don't, it proves them wrong. She was right. To Jason and the developers, my refusal wasn't just stubbornness. It was defiance. Every no I gave them was a reminder that their shiny plans meant nothing against roots that ran deeper than paper. But when Ruth left that night, I sat at the table longer, the lamp flickering against the old deed box. For the first time, I felt the doubt pressing heavier than usual. What if they were right? What if I was just a relic, clinging to land that no longer mattered? The next morning, I pulled on my boots and walked the fields, letting the cold air bite at my cheeks. My knees ached, my breath came short, but I walked every acre, past the sagging barn, past the broken fence, down to the creek where the water still whispered beneath thin ice. And as I walked, my father's voice came back to me, as clear as the day he'd first said it. "This land will outlast all of us, Frank. Treat it right, and it'll carry you when nothing else does." I stopped at the south pasture and ran my hand through the soil, dark and rich even under frost. The ground was alive, not worthless, not barren, alive. The kind of alive that waits, patient for its season to speak. Neighbors might laugh, Jason might sneer, banks might threaten, but none of them had walked these acres the way I had. None of them had smelled the spring earth waking after winter, or felt the hum of life rising from underfoot. This farm wasn't just land, it was memory, it was promise, and though I stood alone in those fields, I felt something steady itself inside me. Let them call it worthless. Let them pressure and mock and threaten. They didn't know the truth I knew. The land wasn't finished, and neither was I. Winter loosened its grip slowly that year. By March, the snow melted into rivulets that carried mud down the gullies, and the ground softened beneath my boots. I walked the south pasture one morning, listening to the water trickle beneath the thaw, when I noticed something odd. The creek that cut across the edge of the field shimmered darker than usual, as if an oil slick floated across its surface. At first I thought it was runoff from a neighbor's machinery, maybe a tractor leaking diesel upstream, but the sheen didn't wash away with the current. It clung, swirling iridescent in the sunlight. I crouched, dipped a stick in, and lifted it out. The smell was sharp, metallic, not like manure or fuel. It reminded me of something I'd smelled years ago when an oil company drilled test wells 2 counties over. I wiped the stick on my pants and stood there longer than I meant to, watching the dark swirls shift with the flow. For a moment, my heart thudded faster, but then doubt cut in. Don't be a fool, Frank. You've seen strange things in creeks before. Algae, runoff, God knows what else. Don't build castles out of shadows. Still, the thought stuck with me. A week later, while repairing the north fence line, my old tractor bogged down in a patch of wet earth. The rear wheel spun deep, flinging mud, and the smell hit me again. Sharp, chemical, almost oily. I cut the engine, climbed down, and pressed my boot into the muck. Black streaks clung to the sole, darker than ordinary soil. I scraped some into an old coffee tin and carried it back to the farmhouse. That night, I set it on the kitchen table. Turning it under the lamplight, Ruth laughed when she saw it the next morning. "Frank, you've brought home mud like it's gold dust. Don't tell me you've gone superstitious now." "Not superstitious," I said quietly. "Curious." She raised an eyebrow but didn't press. Ruth knew better than anyone that once I latched onto a thought, I'd follow it until I knew the truth. Then came the surveyors. I first spotted them near the county road, 2 men with neon vests unloading equipment from a van. They claimed they were mapping easements for infrastructure, but I knew what a seismic sensor looked like. I'd seen enough in my lifetime to recognize the gear of men searching for what lies under the ground, not on top of it. When I asked what they were doing, one smiled too quick. "Just routine county work, sir." "Funny," I said, nodding to the device in his hand. "I didn't know the county used seismic testers to fix culverts." He froze, then mumbled something about subcontracting before packing up faster than I'd ever seen. By the time I reached the lane, their van was gone, dust curling behind it. That night, I pulled the old deed box down again. The mineral rights my father had underlined decades ago, all rights in and to the subsurface estate, are hereby reserved to the grantor and his heirs, glowed under the lamplight like scripture. My father hadn't been a lawyer, but he'd been wise enough to guard what others ignored. I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling beams, hearing his voice again. "This land has more in it than you'll ever know." The next morning I drove to the county library. It had been years since I'd sat in those quiet stacks, but the maps and the geological surveys were still there, collecting dust in cabinets no one touched. I spent hours unrolling charts, tracing fault lines and rock formations across Maplewood. There it was, plain as day, a shale deposit running directly beneath my acreage. I left with copies folded under my arm, my mind buzzing. If the creek's sheen was what I thought, if the surveyors were who I suspected, then the whispers of worthless land were not just wrong. They were the kind of lie men tell when they're trying to get something cheap. But I didn't tell anyone. Not Ruth, not the neighbors, not even Earl down at the diner who'd always been loyal. Some truths aren't meant for sharing until the moment is right. Weeks passed and small signs kept piling up. A contractor knocked, claiming he wanted to inspect my property lines for a potential road expansion. A company mailed me an unsolicited offer, far higher than the ones before. Jason showed up again, slicker than ever, insisting he had connections that could help me sell quick, before trouble found me. Trouble. That was the word he used? I smiled thinly and sent him on his way. But when his taillights disappeared down the lane, I stood alone in the driveway, the papers from the library tucked safe in my jacket. Trouble wasn't coming for me. Trouble was already waiting for the men who thought I didn't know the truth. The land was speaking, not with crops or cattle, but with something older, deeper, blacker than earth. And I was listening. The more I tried to ignore it, the more the land whispered back. Each day I walked the pastures. The signs seemed to multiply, dark streaks near the creek bed, that sharp scent of oil rising from the ground when the soil was wet, and the surveyors who never quite looked me in the eye. I couldn't sit with just guesses anymore. Curiosity had turned into resolve. One morning I drove to an old friend, Tom Whitaker, a geologist who had retired from the state energy office years earlier. Tom and I had fished together back when our children were small. He was one of the few men left in Maplewood who still believed a handshake meant something. When I knocked on his door, he eyed the tin can in my hand. "Frank Cole," he said with a grin. You've either brought me worms for fishing or mud for studying. Which is it? Something in between, I told him. We sat at his kitchen table while he spread the soil sample on a glass dish under a bright lamp. He sniffed, poked, even lit a match near the edge of the smear. The flame flared quick, then sputtered. He raised his eyebrows. "Frank," he said, lowering his voice, "this isn't just ordinary muck. You've got hydrocarbons in this soil. That sheen in your creek wasn't your imagination?" My chest tightened. "You mean—" He nodded. "Oil or something close enough. Likely a shale deposit underneath your land. Shallow enough that seepage is reaching the surface." I leaned back in my chair, silent for a long while. All those years people called my land worthless, and here it was, worth more than all their shiny subdivisions combined. But Tom wasn't finished. He disappeared into his study and returned with rolled charts. Back in the 80s, the state surveyed portions of Maplewood. Nothing commercial came of it then. Prices were too low. Technology wasn't ready. But he spread a map across the table and tapped a thick band running straight through the area marked Coal Farm. "See this? Shale seam. Runs deep and wide. Back then it was ignored. Today companies would kill for access to it." I stared at the map. My land, mocked as barren, sat atop black gold. Tom looked me in the eye. "You tell anyone about this?" "Not a soul." "Good," he said firmly. "Keep it that way. If the developers or your nephew know, they'll try to box you out. Wait until you've got leverage, real contracts, signed papers. Until then, silence is your strongest ally." I drove home with those words ringing in my ears. Silence, patience, the same tools I'd always known. That night, I pulled the deed box out again, hands steady now instead of uncertain. I laid the mineral rights paper flat and read it 3 times under the lamplight. All rights in and to the subsurface estate are hereby reserved to the grantor and his heirs. My father had underlined those words 50 years ago. He hadn't known about shale seams or hydrocarbons, but he'd known enough to guard what others ignored. I whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Dad. The land carries more than we'll ever see at first glance." Over the next weeks, I moved carefully. I called a small, independent survey firm out of the neighboring county, a firm with no ties to Jason or Maplewood's developers. I told them nothing of oil, only that I wanted a geological assessment for personal records. They came quiet, worked thorough, and left without fanfare. 2 weeks later, the report arrived. The envelope was thick, stamped confidential. My hand shook as I opened it at the kitchen table. Page after page of graphs, seismic readings, and soil analysis confirmed what Tom had hinted. Significant shale deposits beneath Coal Farm, potentially oil-bearing, commercially viable if tapped. At the bottom, in crisp letters, it said, "Estimated reserve value, substantial, substantial." A word so cold and technical, but in it lived a vindication deeper than any applause. The land they called worthless was worth more than any of them had ever dreamed. I set the papers back into the deed box, slid it under the bench, and locked the latch. My heart pounded, but my face held steady. I knew better than to celebrate too soon. Oil is as much curse as blessing when the wrong men catch its scent. So I went about my days as usual. I mended fences, I greased the tractor. I drank coffee at the diner and let Jason smirk when he saw me. I even nodded politely when a developer's man came by with another generous offer. They still thought I was the fool. But every night when I lit the lamp and opened that survey report, I knew the truth. The fool was never me, and one day soon, when the time was right, the men who mocked me would crawl back, not with laughter in their throats, but with begging in their eyes. Rumors in a small town spread faster than fire in dry grass. For months I had kept the survey report locked in my deed box, showing it to no one but Ruth, who swore on our mother's memory she'd keep silent. But by spring, whispers began circling anyway. It started subtle. The men at the diner, the same ones who used to chuckle about my worthless farm, began asking casual questions. "Frank, you had any appraisers out lately?" one would say, sipping his coffee too slow. Another leaned in, voice oily with false curiosity. "Heard there's been interest in land around your way." I played dumb, as if I hadn't noticed the gleam in their eyes. "Interest? Only in the deer that keep chewing my corn," I'd reply. They laughed, but the tension in their voices betrayed the truth. They'd caught wind of something. The first real sign came when a man in a gray suit knocked on my door with an envelope. "Mr. Cole," he said smoothly, "our firm would like to extend you a new offer. Cash, well above market value." I opened the envelope and read the number. It was triple what developers had offered before. Enough to buy a house in town, 2 trucks, and still have money in the bank. But I didn't even blink. "No sale," I said, handing it back. The man hesitated, clearly shocked. "Sir, perhaps you don't understand. This is a once-in-a-lifetime deal." I looked him square in the eyes. "Son, this land has already given me a lifetime. I'm not about to sell it for yours." He left with stiff shoulders, and by the next week, the offers doubled again. Then Jason came, crawling. He pulled up in his shiny truck one Saturday, dust trailing like smoke. He stepped out wearing a pressed shirt and that same cologne that made the air choke. But his smile was different this time, tight, almost nervous. "Uncle Frank," he said, voice dripping with sugar, "I've been thinking. Maybe I was too harsh before. We're family after all, and families should work together." I leaned against the porch rail, arms crossed. "Work together how?" "Well," he scratched his chin, glancing toward the fields. "Word around town is you might have some opportunities out here. Oil, maybe, or minerals. Whatever it is, I want to help you manage it. I've got contacts, investors, people who could make sure you're not taken advantage of." I laughed. It wasn't a kind laugh. "Taken advantage of? You mean like when you mocked me at Thanksgiving? When you told half the county my land was worthless?" He flushed, but quickly covered it. "That was before I knew the potential. Look, Uncle Frank, I only want what's best for you. At your age, dealing with contracts and companies isn't easy. Let me handle it. You can trust me." "Trust," I repeated, spitting the word out like a bad taste. "Jason, I trusted you once. I taught you the feel of soil, the weight of tools, the value of patience, and you mocked all of it. Now that the land proves you wrong, you expect me to hand it over?" He tried to smile again, but it wavered. "I just think it would be a shame if something this big slipped through your fingers. You could be rich." I shook my head. "Rich isn't my goal. Secure is, and this land is already that." Jason left in a huff, slamming his truck door harder than necessary. But within a week, more relatives appeared. Cousins I hadn't heard from in years stopped by, just to visit, their eyes scanning the property lines more than my face. One even brought me a bottle of whiskey as if a gift could erase years of silence. They all circled the same point, though: partnership, help, management. Even the bank softened its tone. Carter Pike called me personally. His voice, once smug, now carried a note of respect, or desperation. "Mr. Cole, we've reconsidered your accounts. If you'd like to expand operations, we can offer generous credit. We value your assets." Assets? That was the word he used now, where months ago it had been burden. I thanked him politely and hung up. It was almost amusing watching the same people who dismissed me now twist themselves into knots to win favor. The very men who told me the farm was a relic now begged to be part of its future. But I didn't say yes. I didn't even say maybe. I stayed silent, letting them squirm, letting their curiosity grow into need. Because patience is the weapon of men who know the value of waiting. Each evening I sat on the porch, the survey report locked away, watching the sun dip over the Palm Hills. Oil rigs weren't there yet, but in my mind I could already see them rising like iron giants. The land had been mocked, and so had I. Now both of us were preparing to answer back, and soon, when the truth could no longer be hidden, every last one of them would crawl. not just with polite offers, but on their knees, begging for a piece of what they had thrown away. By midsummer, the whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Everywhere I went, eyes followed me with curiosity, envy, and barely hidden greed. At the diner, men paused mid-bite when I walked in, their conversations faltering. At church, people who hadn't shaken my hand in years suddenly clutched it like I was their long-lost brother. Even the county commissioner stopped by one morning pretending to be concerned about my health, but his questions all circled the same drain. What lies under your land, Frank? I had been patient when Jason mocked me, patient when the developers tried to corner me, patient when the bank circled like a hawk. But patience isn't meant to last forever. There comes a time when silence isn't strength anymore. It's strategy waiting for its strike. That strike came one evening at a community meeting in the Maplewood Town Hall. Jason had organized it himself, proud as a peacock, to announce his latest development scheme. He called it The Future of Maplewood, a glossy presentation about new subdivisions, shopping centers, and progress. He invited investors, townsfolk, and even the local paper. Ruth convinced me to attend. If he's dragging your name into the dirt in public, she said, you ought to defend yourself in public too. The hall was packed. Folding chairs scraped against the floor, the smell of coffee and paper programs filling the air. Jason stood at the front, pointing at charts projected on a screen. This is the future, he declared, his voice smooth. New jobs, new housing, growth for our children. But first, we must let go of the past. The old farms, the barren lands clung to by those who can't accept change. He didn't say my name, but everyone knew who he meant. The crowd chuckled in agreement. Jason smiled wider. Some folks still believe their tired acres hold value. But we must be realistic. Maplewood can't build tomorrow on yesterday's dust. I stood then, slowly, my chair creaking. Heads turned, whispers rising. Jason froze, color draining from his face for just a second before he smirked. Uncle Frank, he said lightly, glad you could join us. Please, have a seat. We don't want to tire you out. I ignored the barb and walked to the front. You talk about dust, Jason, but dust doesn't seep into creeks. Dust doesn't make surveyors sneak onto land. Dust doesn't draw men with envelopes of cash. The room went still. I reached into my coat and pulled out the folded papers, the independent survey report and the certified deed with mineral rights. I laid them on the podium for everyone to see. You call my farm worthless, yet these reports, signed and sealed, say otherwise. Under those fields you mock lies, a shale seam rich enough to fuel half this county, and the rights to that seam belong to me, by inheritance, by law, and by every ounce of patience you threw away. Gasps filled the hall. The commissioner leaned forward, his mouth hanging open. Investors whispered fiercely among themselves. Ruth, sitting in the second row, folded her arms with a smile sharp as a knife. Jason stammered, his polish cracking. That can't be. You're making it up. Old papers don't mean anything. I slammed my hand on the podium, the sound echoing. Don't they? Here's the deed, signed by my father in 1948, reserving mineral rights. Here's the survey, dated this year, confirming deposits under my land. You mocked me for clinging to the past, Jason, but it was the past that saved me, and will bury your lies. The crowd erupted, some in shock, others in applause. The investors who had been hanging on Jason's every word now turned their attention to me, their faces alight with greed, but also respect. Jason's mouth opened and closed like a fish. Uncle Frank, we could work together. With my connections, we could... I cut him off. Number. When I needed family, you gave me ridicule. When I needed respect, you gave me laughter. Now that the land speaks, you want to share in its voice? Not a chance. This legacy doesn't belong to you, Jason. It never did. Silence fell again, heavy and final. Jason sank back into his chair, his face red, His shoulders hunched. For the first time, the room saw him not as a visionary, but as a fool. I gathered my papers and turned to leave. As I passed Ruth, she whispered, "That was your father's voice speaking through you." And maybe it was, because as I stepped out into the warm night air, the cicadas buzzing, I felt lighter than I had in years. I had carried the weight of their laughter, their insults, their doubt. Tonight, I laid it down. The farm wasn't worthless, and neither was the old man who refused to let it go. The morning after that meeting, Maplewood wasn't the same. The diner buzzed with talk, but the laughter was gone. Now it was awe, shock, and a little fear. I could feel it the second I walked through the door. Men who used to smirk at me now pulled out chairs, offering me a seat like I was some kind of honored guest. Even Earl, who'd always been kind, gave me a nod that carried something new: respect. Jason, on the other hand, disappeared for a few days. Folks said he was holed up at the bank, begging for emergency financing for his development project. Others whispered he'd driven to the city to court investors. But no matter where he went, the story followed him. The land he mocked as worthless was sitting on oil, and the rights belonged not to him, but to the old fool he had laughed at. I didn't go chasing anyone. I kept to my routine, feeding the hens, mending fences, walking the creek. But each day, new visitors arrived at my gate. Men in press suits, women with clipboards, folks I'd never seen before in Maplewood. They all came with the same pitch, dressed up in different words. "Mr. Cole, this is your chance. Partner with us. We'll handle the messy details. You'll never have to lift a finger." Some brought gifts: fine bottles of whiskey, baskets of fruit, glossy brochures. One even brought a contract already filled in, the ink blank only on my signature line. I stacked them all on the kitchen counter and never touched them again. Jason finally showed up on the 5th day. He didn't drive his shiny truck this time. He came in a borrowed sedan, his shirt sleeves rolled up like he was trying to look humble. I was out on the porch sharpening tools when he walked up the steps with a forced smile. "Uncle Frank," he began, his voice softer than I'd ever heard it, "I know we got off on the wrong foot. I said things I shouldn't have, about you, about the farm. I was wrong." I let the whetstone scrape once more before setting it down. "Wrong doesn't undo what's said." "I know," he said quickly, his hands twisting together. "But listen, you don't have to handle this alone. Oil contracts, drilling rights, royalties. These companies will eat you alive if you're not careful. Let me help. I've got contacts, experience." "Experience?" I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Your experience is selling out family land to developers and mocking the man who gave you a start. That's not experience I need." His face flushed. "I just want a chance, a seat at the table. I don't want to be left out when—" "You left yourself out the day you called this farm worthless," I said, my voice sharp now. "The day you laughed with your friends while I sat at the end of the table like a ghost. You think I forgot that?" He tried one last, desperate angle. "Uncle, please. We're family." I leaned forward, locking eyes with him. "Family protects. Family respects. You broke both. Don't call me uncle when what you really want is oil." His shoulders sagged, and for once Jason had nothing left to say. He turned and walked back down the porch steps, his shoes heavy in the gravel. But he wasn't the only one crawling. That same afternoon, the county commissioner himself stopped by, hat in hand. "Mr. Cole," he said nervously, "about those code violations on your barn. Perhaps we were a bit too hasty. If you'd like, we can revisit those assessments." I almost laughed. Months ago, they threatened fines and red tags. Now, they offered apologies. At the bank, Carter Pike sent a letter dripping with honey. "We'd be honored to restructure your accounts, Mr. Cole. In fact, we'd like to extend a preferred line of credit to support any future projects you may have." The same man who once hinted I might lose my farm now begged for my business. I burned the letter in the wood stove. Slowly, Piece by piece, the balance shifted. The men who once held power over me now lined up like schoolchildren, waiting for permission, and I gave them nothing. No commitments, no contracts, no promises. Because I had learned something through all the humiliation. Power doesn't come from shouting or showing off. Power comes from patience, from letting others dig their own graves, then standing above them when the dirt settles. By the end of that week, Jason wasn't strutting through town anymore. He avoided eye contact, kept his head low. People who once praised him now muttered behind his back. And when they looked at me, they didn't see the old farmer they once mocked. They saw the man who owned the land, the man who owned the future. The tables had turned, and this time I was the one writing the rules. The week after the town hall meeting felt like a long thaw in Maplewood. The ice that had held people's mouths in one shape, a smirk for me, a cheer for Jason, melted into something colder for him and warmer for me. I didn't have to do anything. I fed the hens, patched a fence, watched fog lift out of the bottoms. By noon each day, the news came to my porch without my asking. At the diner, Earl slid into the booth across from me and spoke low. "Your nephew's project lost its anchor investor," he said, eyes on his coffee. "Guy from the city, pulled out overnight, said the land assumptions were materially altered." I nodded. Jason had built his castles on other people's confidence. The minute confidence left, the wind had a clean shot. 2 days later, Carter Pike from the bank stopped me on Main Street. He'd shaved his beard, maybe to look new again, but a fresh face couldn't hide worry. "Mr. Cole," he began, his voice rehearsed, "I want to assure you our institution values long relationships." "You mean mine," I said. He swallowed. "We have concerns about Mr. Jason Cole's line of credit. The development's collateral hinged on contiguous acreage. Without your farm, the risk profile was always what it was," I finished. "You just like the shine." He didn't argue. Men rarely do when they've started using phrases like risk profile and market conditions to cover the weather they didn't read. By the weekend, the country club was telling a different story too. A friend of Ruth's, who taught piano out there, reported that Jason's name had been quietly removed from a fundraiser program, like a stain blotted from linen. And the commissioner, who had once stapled violations to my gate, suddenly had a challenger for his seat, one who promised respect for legacy landowners and ethics in permitting. Even politicians remember who owns the winter when the wind changes. I saw Jason only in glimpses at first, hunched shoulders outside the bank, head lowered at the grocery, where the checker didn't meet his eye. Pride is private until it becomes public, and then every step a man takes sounds like penance. He came to the farm one evening just before sundown. No cologne, no smile, curled like a hook. He stood at the bottom of the steps, hands empty. "Uncle Frank," he said, not climbing, not claiming the porch like he used to, "I'm in trouble." I didn't say I know. Trouble had been circling him since the first time he called soil inventory. "They're calling notes," he went on. "Investors want clawbacks. The county's opened an inquiry into my marketing of the project. Misrepresentation, they say. I didn't misrepresent anything. I just assumed," I said. He flinched. "Yes." Silence settled between us, summer thick. A nighthawk boomed over the pasture. Somewhere a mower coughed out the last of a day's work. "Please," he said finally. "Can you backstop the loan or co-sign a bridge? If I can keep the project alive, I can." I raised a hand. It felt heavy and easy at once. "Jason, a man who's drowning will pull you under if you wade in after him. The best help is sometimes a lesson from the shore." He stared at the boards like they might tell him something different. "So you're going to let me sink?" The old heat crept back into his voice. "After everything I did to modernize this town?" "Son," I said, and the word surprised both of us, "you didn't modernize anything. You polished it and called the shine future. You sold drawings and borrowed against applause." He opened his mouth, shut it, and nodded once. He left without shaking my hand. Gravel made a tired sound under his tires. After he drove off, I walked down to the creek. The water ran blacker in one slow eddy, a mirror tipped with rainbow. I dipped my fingers and brought them to my nose. The scent was clean and fierce as a struck match. The land didn't care about Jason's fall or my rise. It only kept its promises to those who kept theirs. In town, the unraveling quickened. A contractor filed suit against Jason for non-payment on preliminary grading he'd ordered in anticipation of approvals that never came. The state ethics office sent a letter to the commissioner about irregularities in the permitting queue, letters he'd signed that just happened to favor developers who bought him lunch. The insurance adjuster who'd warned me about my barn now recommended the county assist legacy properties in making code repairs, as if the same mouth could lift a curse it had laid. At church, the reverend's sermon was on the prodigal son, but he spent an extra minute on the older brother, the one who stayed, who kept the field, who didn't mistake quiet for weakness. No one looked back at me, but I felt the glances all the same. Then came the day the for sale sign appeared on Jason's lawn, hidden behind a shrub like a boy hiding a broken window. His wife Patricia passed me at the feed store with a nod that was part apology, part ache, part pride refusing to kneel. Life has a way of balancing the ledger where courts move too slow. Green Ridge Development, the first outfit that had slid shiny folders across my porch table, filed a notice in the paper. Material adverse change. Intent to withdraw. I read it over eggs at the diner and slid the paper to Earl, who whistled low. "They're running," he said, "and they're doing it loud so no one mistakes who they think is to blame." "They'll blame the old man with the deed," I said. Earl grinned. "Let 'em. Folks know whose side the creek runs on now." Not everyone turned, of course. A pair of city lawyers tried to spook me with talk of unitization and compulsory pooling, as if big words could unfasten an old promise. I invited them to the porch, poured coffee into cups with hairline cracks, and let them speak until they realized I understood enough to say no. They left with their briefcases fuller of air than when they came. The worst of it for Jason wasn't the money. Money can be lost, then made again. The worst was the quiet. People in town stopped calling him by name and started saying, "that coal boy," like he was a sad headline. Invitations dried up. A man who had once believed rooms brightened when he entered now shadowed the doorways he used to command. Loss teaches humility or bitterness. You can tell which one a man chooses by whether he looks you in the eye. Ruth kept me from hardening too far. "He's still family," she said one evening as we shelled peas on the porch. "Foolish, yes, but the same blood that makes you stubborn made him proud. Pride just burns faster." "I won't crush him," I said, "but I won't prop him up either." "That's right," she said. "Let the ground firm beneath him before he stands again." For a brief, ugly stretch, Jason struck back in the only way pride knows. He spread talk that oil was a poison, that my creek would kill cattle downriver, that I'd sell Maplewood to the highest bidder and send my money north. It didn't last. I'd already hired an environmental firm, quiet, thorough, to test the water and soil. When their report came back clean within standards, I handed a copy to the editor of the county paper and another to the commissioner's challenger. Lies don't hold once light finds them. The last time I saw Jason that summer, he was loading boxes into a storage unit at the edge of town. He saw my truck and went still, a man deciding whether to be angry or ashamed. He chose the truer one. "I'll be all right," he said without prompting. "I've got some work lined up with a builder in Pine Ridge. Smaller stuff." "Smaller can be truer," I said. He nodded. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry." His voice cracked on the last word like a board straightened by heat that still remembers the bend. "I know," I said. "Do better." He shut the unit door, rolled the lock, and walked past me without asking for anything more. That, too, was a kind of apology. By then, the collapse had completed its circle. The men who'd mocked, the offices that had threatened, the bank that had tried to nudge me to the auction block, all of them had come up against something they couldn't move. A deed signed in 1948, a seam of shale older than their charts, and an old man who wouldn't sell his name for comfort. Maplewood settled into a new quiet, the kind that means storms have passed and the air is ready for work. I didn't celebrate. I stacked the pea vines behind the hen house, fixed a hinge on the smokehouse door, and set the deed box back in its place. The land had taught me the same lesson since I was a boy. When a field lies down, after wind, you don't clap. You check the fences and you plan the planting. The mockers had fallen, not pushed, not tripped. They walked themselves to the edge and kept walking, and out beyond the south pasture, where the ground rose, just enough to catch the long light, I could imagine iron rising slowly, orderly, lawful on my terms, not to spite a town, but to feed it, not to prove worth, but to put it to work. The creek whispered over stones, the nighthawk boomed and turned. Dusk took its time laying down. Tomorrow, I thought, would be for building. By the time autumn touched Maplewood, the farm had shifted from being a punchline to a promise. What once looked like tired pastures and leaning barns now glimmered in the eyes of outsiders as untapped wealth. But I didn't let that change me. At 72, I'd learned the best way to steady yourself in a storm was to keep doing the same things that had always grounded you. So I rose at dawn, brewed my coffee black, fed the hens, and walked the fence lines as if nothing in the world had changed. But everything had. Within weeks of Jason's collapse, I had taken meetings, not with the flashy developers who had mocked me before, but with a small, regional energy firm recommended by my friend Tom Whitaker. Men who still took their hats off when they entered your house. Men who spoke plain, not with buzzwords or glossy promises. They respected the land, not just the oil beneath it. We sat around my kitchen table, their contracts spread alongside my father's deed papers. I read every line twice, sometimes 3 times, before nodding. You drill on my land, I told them. You do it clean. No shortcuts, no poison in the creek, and the rights remain mine. Lease, not sale. The lead man, a weathered fellow named Cooper, tipped his hat. Mr. Cole, we wouldn't have it any other way. Your land, your name. We just bring the rigs. By October, the first trucks rumbled down the lane, carrying iron towers that rose slow but certain onto the sky. The town gathered along the ridge to watch, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. Where they once saw a relic, they now saw an empire being born. The clang of steel echoed through the valley as the rigs were raised. Lights glowed through the night as crews worked shifts, their floodlamps casting long shadows across the fields. The smell of oil mixed with autumn leaves, sharp and powerful. For the first time in decades, I felt the land not just feeding me, but roaring with hidden strength. Neighbors who once mocked me now came to shake my hand. Farmers who had sold their land for pennies regretted it openly. One old acquaintance, Harold Briggs, stopped me in town and muttered, "Frank, I'll admit it. I thought you were stubborn to the point of foolishness. But you were right. You always were." I only nodded. Vindication doesn't need a speech. The change wasn't just in talk. It was in work. Men who had been laid off from Jason's failed project now lined up for jobs on the rigs. Young folks who once fled Maplewood for city wages came back to earn an honest paycheck. The farm, once called barren, was now putting bread on tables across the county. Ruth sat on the porch with me one evening, watching the rigs pump in their steady rhythm. "It's strange," she said softly. "When Dad talked about the land carrying us, I always thought he meant corn and cattle." "Never imagined this." "Neither did I admitted. "But maybe he saw further than we gave him credit for." She reached over and squeezed my hand. "You gave Maplewood back its spine, Frank. Don't ever forget that." But I didn't let the new wealth change my pace. I still drove my old truck to town. I still ate eggs at the diner. I still patched fences with baling wire when the posts leaned. The difference was now, when I walked into a room, The whispers had turned to nods. People didn't laugh at the old fool anymore. They tipped their hats, offered their hands, and sometimes stepped aside. And Jason, he stayed quiet, too quiet. I heard he had taken work out of town, hammering nails for a builder, his name whispered now with pity rather than pride. But he hadn't been back to face me. Not yet. One night, as I watched the rigs turning steady under the floodlights, I thought of him. I thought of every insult, every laugh, every cruel whisper at that family dinner. I thought of how he'd told me my land was worthless. And now I wondered if he was sitting somewhere, staring at the ground under his boots, realizing it wasn't the land that had failed him. It was his own pride. The farm was reborn, not just as an oil field, but as a symbol, a reminder that worth is not decided by those who laugh the loudest, but by those who endure the longest. And I had endured. Tomorrow, I knew, there would be more contracts, more decisions, more men knocking at my door. But for now, I sat on that porch, listening to the rhythm of iron pumping deep in the earth, and I smiled. The land had kept its promise. And so had I. When the rigs had been standing for a month, Maplewood finally grew quiet. Not silent like absence, but silent like respect. For years I had walked into the diner under a weight of snickers, whispers about stubbornness, and half-hidden smirks. Now, when I pushed the door open and the bell rang overhead, forks paused mid-air, not out of mockery, but out of regard. Men straightened in their seats. A few even stood to shake my hand. Respect doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it comes with silence, the kind that lingers when a man proves the truth by outlasting the lies. I remember one Saturday morning, Earl called me over to the counter. "Frank," he said, sliding me a cup of coffee, "you've done more for this town by sitting still than others did by running their mouths for 20 years. He didn't need to say Jason's name. It hung in the room like a shadow no one wanted to claim. Jason had all but vanished from Maplewood life. His name no longer graced the bulletin board at the country club, nor the fundraiser flyers he once strutted across. I heard his wife had moved in with her sister, tired of shouldering his shame. And when he did appear in town, for groceries or a quick errand, he walked fast, eyes down, a man who once thought himself untouchable, now bruised by every glance. I didn't gloat. I didn't sneer. The land had already spoken for me. There was no need to raise my voice. The county commissioner, the same man who had stapled code violations to my barn, now stopped by to commend me on my contribution to Maplewood's prosperity. He fumbled with his hat like a schoolboy caught in a lie. I let him speak, thanked him politely, and closed the door. Justice had no need of my anger. It had already stripped him of his pride. Even Carter Pike at the bank changed his tune. He sent letters filled with offers of preferred accounts and exclusive services. I filed them in the wood stove one by one, the flames curling the paper into ash. Once he had hinted I might lose everything. Now he begged for a seat at my table. That was all the justice I needed. But perhaps the sweetest moment came not in words or contracts, but in a silence that spoke volumes. It was Sunday morning at church. For months, Jason and I had sat at opposite ends, the air between us heavy with unspoken tension. That morning, though, Jason slipped in late, tried to sit in the back pew. When the Reverend preached about humility, the kind that grows from ashes rather than applause, I caught Jason's eyes flick up, then drop again. When service ended, people clustered around me, shaking hands, nodding, patting my shoulder. Jason lingered at the edge of the crowd, alone, waiting for a path to clear. But no one spoke to him. No one asked about his plans or his projects. The man who once demanded attention now lived in the quiet shame of being ignored. I didn't approach him. I didn't need to. The silence around him was its own verdict. That night, Ruth sat with me on the porch, her knitting needles clicking in the fading light. "You've been vindicated, Frank," she said softly. "Not by shouting, not by fighting, just by standing. I took a slow sip of coffee and let the truth settle in my bones. "Funny thing," I said. "They called me stubborn like it was a curse. Turns out stubborn was just another word for faithful." The rigs pumped steady in the distance, their rhythm like a heartbeat across the fields. Maplewood's chatter had quieted, Jason's laughter had long died, and the town's respect had returned, not in loud declarations, but in the silent nods of men who finally saw what had been in front of them all along. Justice had come, not with a bang, not with a fight, but with silence, the kind that proves the storm has passed and left only truth behind. And as I sat there, listening to the earth give back what it had kept hidden for decades, I understood something my father had tried to tell me long ago. Worth isn't measured by the noise others make about you. It's measured in the silence they keep when you've proved them wrong. Winter settled early that year, laying its pale hand across Maplewood. Frost painted the barns white at dawn, and the air carried a hush that felt almost reverent. From my porch, I watched the rigs in the south pasture moving slow and steady, their arms bowing and rising against the horizon like giants paying respect. Each pump stroke reminded me of the journey, the laughter, the whispers, the humiliation, and finally the silence of justice. At 72, I knew my life was more behind me than ahead, but I also knew I had lived long enough to see the land defend me. That, more than money or contracts or oil checks, was the legacy I wanted. Ruth often sat with me in the evenings, her knitting in her lap, her voice soft. "You've proved them all wrong, Frank," she said one night as we watched snow begin to fall. "Your patience, your faith, it was never foolish. It was the foundation." I thought about that. They had called me stubborn, useless, outdated. They had mocked my barns, my boots, my way of living. Jason, my own blood, had laughed in front of a hall full of people, certain I was finished. And yet, here I sat, still on the same porch, still with the same land beneath me, and stronger than ever because I had refused to give up what others could not understand. I picked up my father's old ledger again, the one with notes about crops, weather, and repairs written in his careful hand. At the back, in the blank pages, I had begun writing my own reflections. That night, I added one more. They told me my farm was worthless. They mocked my old ways. But the land never lied, and patience never failed. Legacy belongs to those who endure. I closed the book gently, setting it back on the shelf where my father's hand had once placed it. Outside, the snow thickened, laying its quiet blessing across the fields. Jason's downfall no longer consumed me. His pride had written his own ending, and I had no need to twist the knife. The land had been my defense, and time had been my ally. Let him rebuild somewhere else, learn from the ashes of his arrogance. My fight was never to destroy him. It was to hold fast to what mattered. The farm was no longer mocked. It was reborn. And so was I. The old saying in Maplewood used to be that progress came from leaving the past behind. But now, when people looked at me, they saw a different truth. Sometimes progress comes from holding on, from refusing to sell what cannot be measured in dollars. Sometimes progress means waiting, quietly, until the world sees what you knew all along. I leaned back in my chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and breathed in the crisp air. The rigs moved steady in the distance, the house stood firm around me, and Ruth hummed a hymn low under her breath. I'd been called worthless. But in the end, I was the one who endured. And endurance, I realized, is the truest wealth a man can leave behind. If this story inspired you, hit that like button, subscribe for more powerful tales, and tell us in the comments, do you believe patience is the greatest strength in life?